two kids stood at the White Tower window, watching the world outside grow dark. Edward was 12, a king without a crown. His 9-year-old brother Richard tugged his sleeve. "When are we going home?" But Edward had no answer. Their uncle had promised this was only temporary. He always smiled, but his eyes never did. September 1483. Those faces would vanish from that window forever. 5 centuries later, we still don't know what happened to them. Did Richard III murder his nephews for the crown? Did someone else spill royal blood? Or did they escape into history under false names? In 2021, researchers claimed Edward V lived as John Evans in Devon. Ancient bones wait in Westminster Abbey for DNA testing. But early 2025 brought shocking news. Construction near the tower uncovered remains of over 20 individuals from the 1200s to 1600s. The discovery suggests something far more sinister than expected. The mystery might finally have an answer, but the truth will shock you. If you're drawn to history's darkest secrets, stay with me, because tonight we're not just telling a tale of 2 lost boys. We're opening a case that kings and queens have tried to hide for over 500 years.
Edward and Richard weren't just any children. They were born into the deadliest family in England.
Their father, Edward IV, had clawed his way to the throne through the Wars of the Roses. Blood, betrayal, brother fighting brother. This wasn't Game of Thrones. This was real life in medieval England, and it was far more brutal. But for young Edward and Richard, life was golden. Edward, the elder prince, grew up knowing he would be king. He had tutors, fine clothes, and the love of his mother, Elizabeth Woodville. Little Richard looked up to his big brother like he hung the stars. Everything changed on April 9th, 1483. King Edward IV collapsed at Westminster Palace and died within hours. He was only 40 years old. Maybe poison, maybe illness. No one knows for sure. At Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, 12-year-old Prince Edward was practicing Latin when a mud-splattered messenger arrived 5 days later. The boy learned he was now Edward V, King of England. His childhood had just ended forever. But Edward IV's sudden death created a deadly crisis. The Wars of the Roses had been tearing England apart for 30 years. Brothers murdered brothers. Cousins betrayed cousins. The crown passed between rival houses like a blood-soaked prize. Now the Yorkist king was dead, leaving behind a 12-year-old son. Here's where the story gets dangerous. A 12-year-old king needs protection. He needs someone to rule for him until he comes of age. But who could they trust? Their mother's family, the Woodvilles, wanted control. Their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had been named protector by the dying king. And here's the thing about medieval politics. Whoever controls the king controls everything. Elizabeth Woodville knew this. She'd married into royalty from nothing. She'd survived court intrigue for 20 years. She was nobody's fool. But she made one fatal mistake. She didn't trust Richard. Instead, she sent her brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, and her son from her first marriage, Sir Richard Grey, to fetch young Edward and escort him to London for his coronation. But the trap was perfectly planned. They never reached London alive. Richard intercepted them at Stony Stratford on April 30th, 1483. Richard greeted his 12-year-old nephew with warm embraces, shared jokes over dinner, asked about his studies. Young Edward relaxed in his uncle's presence. Then, in the pre-dawn darkness of May 1st, armed men surrounded the inn. Anthony Woodville and Richard Grey were dragged from their beds in chains, arrested for treason. Richard's gentle voice explained everything to the terrified boy. These men were plotting to murder Edward and seize power. Uncle Richard was saving his life. Edward believed him. What choice did a 12-year-old have? On May 19th, Edward V entered the Tower of London. This wasn't imprisonment, it was royal tradition. Every monarch stayed in the tower before coronation. The apartments were luxurious, the food excellent. Edward's coronation was set for June 22nd, 1483. London buzzed with preparations. The boy practiced his ceremonial duties, learned the ancient words he would speak. But his mother, Elizabeth, had fled to Westminster Abbey sanctuary, clutching her daughters and youngest son like a woman drowning. She knew Richard now controlled everything. Then Richard made his masterstroke. On June 16th, he convinced the terrified Elizabeth to surrender her baby, 9-year-old Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York. The little boy was brought to the tower to keep his brother company during the lonely weeks before coronation. The reunion broke hearts. Edward hugged his little brother desperately. They were together again, but both sensed something terrible approaching. Servants whispered in corridors. Guards watched them constantly. The promised coronation kept being delayed. What the boys didn't know was that their uncle was about to destroy them with words. On June 22nd, the very day Edward should have been crowned, a priest named Dr. Ralph Shaw delivered a sermon that shattered English history. Standing before a London congregation, he declared that Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were illegitimate bastards. Their father's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid because Edward IV had been secretly contracted to Lady Eleanor Butler before their wedding. It was almost certainly a lie, but it was legally devastating. Parliament immediately declared the princes illegitimate under Titulus Regius. On July 6th, Richard was proclaimed King Richard III with all the pageantry that should have belonged to his nephew. The boys who should have ruled England were now officially bastards, locked away, forgotten about by everyone except their mother weeping in sanctuary. At first, people still saw them. The Great Chronicle of London recorded they were spotted occasionally that summer, sometimes playing in the Tower Gardens. Dr. John Argentine, Edward's physician, visited regularly. The 12-year-old was often sick, always frightened. But gradually, the sightings grew rarer. By September 1483, the tower had fallen completely silent. No laughter, no small faces at windows, no games in the garden. 2 royal princes had walked into the Tower of London that summer, but something else entirely had walked out. And that's where our story takes its darkest turn.
Richard III's behavior became stranger by the day. If the boys had died naturally, illness, accident, even suicide in despair, why not announce it? A royal funeral would have ended all speculation about the succession. Kings had buried dead heirs before. Instead, Richard said nothing. His silence screamed louder than any confession. The princes vanished just like thin air. But if Richard III killed them, why did even his allies whisper doubts? That's where the story turns darker. In July 1483, desperation drove someone to action. Buildings across London burst into flames in the night, a coordinated distraction while conspirators tried to break the princes out of the tower. The rescue failed, but it proved people still believed Edward and Richard were alive. After that botched attempt, the boys vanished completely. Dominic Mancini, an Italian friar visiting London that summer, recorded details that still chill historians 5 centuries later. Dr. John Argentine, Edward's physician, reported something heartbreaking. The 12-year-old spent hours each day in confession, seeking remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him, a child preparing his soul for death. Those words echo across the centuries. But Richard wasn't the only one with blood on his hands. His closest ally, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, commanded London while Richard traveled north to York in late summer 1483. Stafford had access to the tower. He had opportunity, and he had his own twisted motives. Then something shattered their friendship forever. In October 1483,
Stafford suddenly rebelled against King Richard III. The man who had helped place Richard on the throne now wanted him destroyed. They'd been inseparable allies just months before. What could have driven such bitter betrayal? Here's one terrifying possibility. Stafford killed the princes without Richard's knowledge, thinking it would please his king. But when Richard returned from York and discovered what had happened, he was horrified. The bodies couldn't be shown. Perhaps the killings were too violent, too obviously murder. Maybe the plan had been to poison them quietly, make it look like illness. Instead, something went wrong in the darkness of their chamber. Richard's fury at Stafford would explain everything: the broken friendship, the desperate rebellion, the silence that followed. Stafford's rebellion failed miserably. He was captured trying to flee and executed on November 2nd, 1483, without trial. Whatever secrets he knew about those two little boys died with him. But across the English Channel, another player was making moves that would change everything. Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, had been rotting in exile in Brittany since 1471. His claim to the English throne was pathetically weak. He descended from royalty only through his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, through an illegitimate line. But Henry had something more valuable than bloodline. He had ruthless ambition and a mother who would kill for him. On Christmas Day, 1483, in Rennes Cathedral, Henry Tudor made a public vow that changed English history. He swore to marry Elizabeth of York, eldest daughter of Edward IV, and unite the warring houses. There was just one problem with that romantic promise. If Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were still alive, they came before their sister in succession. Elizabeth couldn't inherit while her brothers lived. Henry's marriage vow was also a death sentence for the princes. Margaret Beaufort, his mother, had spent years at Edward IV's court. She knew the princes personally, had watched them grow up, probably tucked them into bed, told them stories. Could this deeply religious woman really have ordered the murder of children she'd helped raise? The evidence is thin, but the timing is devastating. Henry Tudor only dared claim the throne after the princes vanished. His rebellion gained support precisely because people believed the boys were dead. When Henry's forces finally landed in Wales in August 1485, the stage was set for the Battle of Bosworth Field. On August 22, 1485, Richard III was killed, and Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. Henry immediately ordered the towers searched. The princes were gone. The new king faced a choice: blame Richard for the murders or stay silent. Strangely, Henry didn't publicly accuse Richard of killing the boys until July 1486, nearly a year after becoming King Henry VII. Why wait so long to accuse his predecessor of child murder? Unless Henry Tudor knew exactly what happened to those children. What if he'd ordered it himself?
Before we talk about suspects, let's look at the 2025 discovery that shocked the world. During construction work near the Tower of London, workers digging foundations uncovered human bones. Archaeologists were called in, and what they found was staggering: up to 50 sets of remains, the biggest discovery at the tower in decades. More than 20 of them, including children, dated between the 1200s and 1600s. Could Edward and Richard be among them? The timing matches the years the princes disappeared. But here's the chilling part: these weren't careful burials. Many bodies looked like they were buried in a rush, hidden away after sudden, secret deaths. Two innocent kids, locked away in the Tower of London, and then gone, died, vanished. 4 adults, 4 powerful, calculating adults, had the means, motive, and opportunity to destroy our innocent boys. Their disappearance wasn't just a family tragedy, it was politics at its ugliest. And I want you to help me figure out which one actually did it. Who's responsible? Who silenced the princes in the tower? Before we discuss the evidence, I want to hear from you. When you think about two young princes mysteriously vanishing from a heavily guarded tower, who's your gut instinct telling you is responsible? Is it the uncle who had the most to gain? The ambitious duke with his own royal bloodline? The exiled pretender who needed them dead to claim the throne? Or, and this might shock you, the pious mother figure who everyone trusted? Let's review each suspect because someone among them is the main culprit. Suspect number 1, Richard III, the obvious choice. Richard had everything to gain, didn't he? With his nephews dead, no one could challenge his crown. He controlled the tower completely. No one entered without his permission. The case seems open and shut, except for one problem. Richard's behavior made no sense. But here's where it gets interesting, and I need you to really think about this with me. If he'd killed the boys, why not announce they died of illness? Medieval children died constantly from plague, sweating sickness, consumption. No one would have questioned it. Instead, his silence created rumors that destroyed his reputation and drove nobles to rebellion. Unless the murders went horribly wrong. Maybe the plan was poison, a gentle death that looked natural. But something went wrong in the darkness of their chamber. Maybe the boys woke up and fought. Maybe they screamed. Maybe there was too much blood to explain away. Richard's desperate silence suggests panic, not calculated murder. Suspect number 2, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, the dark horse. Buckingham had commanded London while Richard traveled north. He had access to the princes and his own reasons for wanting them gone. Here's the chilling part. Buckingham descended from royalty through Edward III. With the princes and Richard dead, he might have had his own shot at the throne. But his rebellion against Richard in October 1483 failed catastrophically. What if Buckingham killed the boys thinking it would please Richard, only to discover his king was horrified? That would explain their sudden enmity. Richard couldn't expose Buckingham without admitting he'd lost control of his most valuable prisoners. Buckingham was executed without trial on November 2nd, 1483. His secrets died with him. Suspect number 3, Henry Tudor, famously known as Henry VII. Henry had the strongest motive, but the weakest opportunity. Living in exile in Brittany, he couldn't personally reach the princes, but he had agents in England, including his devoted mother. The timing is suspicious. Henry only declared his intention to marry Elizabeth of York and claim the throne on Christmas Day 1483, months after the princes vanished. His supporters only flocked to his cause once they believed the boys were dead. If Henry ordered the killings through intermediaries, it would explain everything. The prince's death cleared his path to the throne. His later silence about blaming Richard suggests he knew the truth was far more damaging. Our last suspect, Lady Margaret Beaufort. This is where the case gets truly disturbing. Margaret Beaufort was known as a political mastermind who forged alliances, brokered deals, and cleared a path for her son to claim the throne. She had wealth, connections, and agents throughout England. More importantly, she had intimate access to the royal family. She'd served as lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth Woodville. She knew the princes personally, their habits, their fears, their schedules. Historical records show Elizabeth Woodville made an alliance with Margaret Beaufort, agreeing to support Henry Tudor's claim in exchange for his marriage to his daughter, Elizabeth of York, famously known as the White Princess. But there's a dark possibility historians whisper about. What if that alliance included eliminating the princes? Elizabeth might have agreed to sacrifice her sons to save her daughter and ensure her family's survival under a Tudor regime. She might have even offered her daughter's marriage, begged for her sons' lives, and promised they would never claim the crown. Margaret was deeply religious, but she was also ruthlessly pragmatic. She'd survived 4 marriages and countless political upheavals through careful calculation. If killing 2 children secured her son's throne and prevented civil war, she might have convinced herself it was God's will. The most damning evidence?
Margaret had the perfect cover. When the princes disappeared, everyone suspected Richard or Buckingham. No one looked at the pious widow who prayed daily and funded religious charities. She could have ordered their deaths and attended their funeral masses with tears in her eyes, convinced she'd saved England from chaos. But which suspect actually did it? The answer lies in what happened next, and in a mysterious discovery in a Devon village that changes everything.
What if we've been wrong for 5 centuries? What if the princes never died at all? In 2021, researchers made a discovery that stunned the historical world. In the remote Devon village of Coldridge, they found evidence suggesting Edward V may have lived out his days as John Evans, working as a park keeper for his half-brother Thomas Grey, Marquis of Dorset. The evidence is extraordinary. St. Matthew's Church in Coldridge contains a rare stained glass window depicting Edward V, one of only 4 contemporary glass portraits of him in existence. Beneath the royal figure, medieval text reads, "Pueris Edward the Theft," the boy Edward V. But here's what's truly shocking. The church also contains images of an adult man whose face shows injury or disfigurement around the mouth and chin area, alongside an effigy of John Evans that displays similar scarring. Could these be the same person? A boy king who grew into a disfigured adult, hiding in plain sight? John Evans appeared in Coldridge records in 1484, exactly when the princes vanished from history. He was immediately given an official position and title, despite having no apparent background. He commissioned elaborate stained glass windows with royal symbols around 1511, long after it was safe to display Yorkist imagery. The theory is tantalizing, but problematic. Why would only Edward escape? What happened to 9-year-old Richard? And how could a 12-year-old boy, raised as future king, agree to live anonymously as a park keeper? Critics point out that by autumn 1483, England's political class believed Richard III had killed both boys. That belief prompted rebellions and drove nobles to Henry Tudor's cause. If Edward was alive, surely someone would have used him against Richard III or Henry VII. The silence suggests something far more final. The John Evans theory raises more questions than it answers, but it proves the mystery of the princes in the tower still has power to surprise us, even after 5 centuries. But now we might have new evidence that changes everything. Remember, I talked about the bones they found in 2025. Here's the thing, the scientists are still working on them right now as we speak. The DNA tests, they're not done yet. The lab work takes months, sometimes years. What we do know is pretty wild. Among all those old bones near the tower, some belong to kids who died badly. Violence, quick burials. Someone was in a hurry to hide bodies. But here's what's driving everyone crazy. We still don't know if any of those bones belong to our 2 princes. The tests aren't finished. The results aren't in. Maybe in a few months we'll get the call. Maybe those scientists will finally tell us, yes, we found them, Edward and Richard, and here's exactly how they died. Or maybe we'll find out something even crazier, that other kids got caught up in this royal mess. Kids whose names we'll never know. The investigation is still going. The mystery is still unsolved. But I want to know what you think happened. After hearing about Richard III, Buckingham, Henry Tudor, and Lady Margaret Beaufort, who's your gut telling you did it? Was it the uncle who stole the crown? The duke who turned traitor? The guy who needed them dead to become king? Or the mother who would do anything for her son? Those bones might give us the answer someday. But right now, today, what do you think happened to those 2 little boys who walked into the tower and never came out?